In every heartache, there's a hidden seed of strength. Join Portia Booker on The Grief Grantor as we journey through stories of resilience, finding gratitude in the echoes of grief. Together, we transform sorrow into strength, pain into purpose. Welcome to The Grief Grantor, where your healing journey begins.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Grief Grantor. I hope that everyone is doing amazing. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody who is out celebrating whatever you are doing, whether you're eating delicious stuff or indulging in adult beverages, whatever you may want to do, enjoy today. So, first and foremost, before we begin the conversation, and we're going to really be focusing on rethinking mourning, I want to give a special shout out to my two friends, Jamie and Corey, for tying the knot this weekend. It was amazing to be able to enjoy time with both of you as you celebrate your love. And this kind of dives into the conversation a little bit today. Something that came up for me as I was watching the ceremony for my two friends yesterday was the fact that when we're in seasons of grief, there's a bit of a challenge for some of us to incorporate more fun or more play into our everyday. Let that sink in for a minute, because I remember last night, you guys, it's been a long time since I can say I've had so much fun being at an event or an experience, right? Because when we are grieving, right, sometimes there's this level of guilt. Anybody else can relate to that? This feeling of guilt when you are indulging in a new experience, such as going to a wedding or taking an out of town trip, or doing something out of your comfort zone like going ice skating, because there's this level of what I like to call, you're holding on to the memories that you've already created with this individual who you have experienced the transition with. Obviously for me, it's both of my parents, but there's also that yearning to create more experiences as well. Anybody else relate to that? Let me know, because I know for me, that's been something that I've really strived to do this year, is to incorporate more fun, right? Something that I remember from last night from the wedding was both Jamie and Corey, they both, what they like to call, cracked the glass or broke the glass on the floor. And the rabbi who did their wedding officiation, he said that the glass breaking is a symbolization of the fragility of life, right? And when we think about that, in my eyes, with life being so fragile and being so short, why not incorporate new memories and more fun into our life? So, we're going to take our first quick break right here on the Grief Grantor. And when we come back, we are going to be joined by Dr. Karen Kramer, who is a grief recovery expert, retreat center founder, mindset facilitator, speaker, and also the author of Healthy Grief. And we're going to dive more into rethinking mourning. So we'll be right back here on the Grief Grantor.
Hi everyone, I am Sinead from Brador. I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa. Please join me in my Power Hour every Sunday, 12 o'clock Pacific Standard Time on E360 TV. Mwah!
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Grief Grantor. As I mentioned, we are joined by our guest of honor, Dr. Karen. Dr. Karen, welcome to the Grief Grantor. How are you?
Very good, Portia. I'm enjoying this. So thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Karen, I'm truly honored and grateful. I know we were talking a little bit backstage before we went live, and I kind of brought up that story from the wedding, right? And I'm sure that you, being a grief recovery expert, you've seen or felt also this level of needing to incorporate more fun and more play into your life. So, Dr. Karen, I'm going to just dive right in, right? Something that I really like to ask of my guests is, when it comes to grief, right, we have to give ourselves permission, right, to grieve in our own unique way. And I'm curious, Dr. Karen, what did it take for you to grant yourself permission, right, to find an avenue to channel your grief from the transition of your mom, your father, and also your niece?
Well, I'm going to start with the fact that I did not give myself that permission in the beginning. I actually, this is right after my father passed away. I remember how I, I stuffed it all down. I stuffed it all down. I put a smile on my face. I did what I thought I had to do, which was step in and manage all the logistics. So I didn't realize I was not giving myself permission to grieve. And much of my story, including Healthy Grief, the book Healthy Grief, came out of that experience that I had 12 years ago. So fast forward, and you mentioned the most recent loss, which was 2 years ago, which was the passing of my older brother and my mother back to back within 2 weeks. And around that time, I had done a lot of the work to give myself permission to grieve. And even along the process where my brother due to prostate cancer, he went down really quickly without about 3 weeks from really going down to going through hospice and passing. And the day afterwards, my mom looking me in the eyes and saying, I didn't think I was going to live this long. I'm ready to pass over. So giving her permission, where she was looking for permission in my eyes to really say that I was okay. I was giving her permission, which you hinted upon. I did something similar with my niece when she passed away at the age of 36. And then my mom passed away 2 weeks later. What I did during that period of time, I actually was doing Facebook Lives and actually sharing my journey along the way. Similar to what you're doing, and I know this was after your passings, but there's something special about being able to be seen, heard, and felt when we're grieving. And I was doing that, not in a way of like, blah, here's what's going on. It was, here's what's going on for me. Here's what I'm learning in the moment. And here's what I'd like to share along the way. So I truly gave myself permission in that moment that I didn't before. I didn't realize I was not doing that. I was just wearing that fake smile and jumping around as if I had to do everything the way everybody should do and moving along in life. And that was not good for me. It wasn't giving me an opportunity to truly settle into my emotions and healthfully go through the process, because I hit grief hard and anger.
And let's touch on that, Dr. Karen. I mean, because let's be realistic, right? When we're in our grief season, right, there tends to be this thought that we have to fall into the 5 stages of grief, right? And sometimes when we try to follow that motto, it tends to create more of a disconnect with ourselves, with our ability to healthy grieve, right? And I'm curious, Karen, what did that anger for you look like? Was it
Mm.
journaling? Was it projected onto other people? Was it coming out in the form of art? What was that anger like for you?
And I'll expand the story if you'll let me. So we'll start here. It was a month after my father passed away. And I had one of those days. I'll fill in the pieces here in just a bit, but I had one of those days where I just freaking lost it. I was screaming at my mom. I hung up at her. I was yelling at my husband and my kids. I was cussing out my brothers. I had just freaking lost it. And again, I'll fill in the pieces here in just a bit. But I sat back and I realized, oh my God, all the aftermath that I had left. My kids like afraid to talk to me, my mom calling me up but me ignoring, my husband not quite sure what to do. Like I had just lost it, which by the way, this was far from my norm, very far from my norm. And I had just lost it. So I figured, okay, I need to do what normal people would do and I need support. And so I went to see a therapist at that point in time. And now, granted, this was a newly minted therapist. I think she was already a little nervous based upon my background. And what I'm about to say, by the way, has nothing to do negative towards therapists. This was my experience. So please understand this is my experience. Okay. So I walked out of a 45-minute session being labeled with situational anxiety. Yes, I was labeled with situational anxiety. I'm like, I'm not quite sure what to do with this. And she even said, I think you have situational anxiety. Don't you think you have situational anxiety? To the point where I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And I was sent off to anxiety group and all this. It didn't really help. So then I thought, well, maybe I was in my early 40s and I thought, well, maybe I'm going through menopause. So I went to my doctor. Now, again, everything I'm saying has nothing against doctors, and this is my experience. Okay. So walked into the doctor and was explaining to her what was leading up to that day that I just lost it. She stopped me after 2 minutes and wanted to prescribe me drugs, to which I hardly take drugs. I'm like, I've never done, I barely take ibuprofen for anything. So I refused. She insisted, I refused again. So I came home, had another mini mental breakdown, and yelling at my son again. And my husband's like, "Okay, honey, you know that destination spa you've been really wanting to go to? Maybe this is really a good time to actually go off to that destination spa." So I did, and Portia, I will tell you, I had such a wonderful time. It was 7 days of bliss. I was away from everything, healthy food, exercising, massage, facials, everything. It was wonderful. Then within 2 hours of being home, I was bickering with my loving husband again. Nothing to do with him and everything to do with me. And what led up to that? Yes, I already mentioned my father had passed a month before that. And on that day, I had just made the decision to put my 18-year-old beloved cat to sleep. And that's what started me into the grief process. Plus, going to call my mom that day to tell her I had just put my beloved cat to sleep, and then hearing about some family dynamics that on a normal day would have irritated me, but not to the extreme where I just exploded over everybody. So when we're in the middle of this grief, it's not so much the loss itself. We're talking about death and dying. For me, I'm talking about any kind of loss from the divorce or a loss of health or career. So I work with clients who are various different kinds of losses, but it's not so much the loss itself, it's everything else that's underneath those traumas, those triggers, those limiting beliefs. So when we truly go into and hit that loss and we start to act out, as I did, there's a lot more that's underneath that. And I actually talk about one of those stories in Healthy Grief, which is around what was underneath it for me. What was one of the limiting beliefs that I had that really led me to act out and explode all over my family?
Dr. Karen, I could relate when you were talking about this experience with this therapist, being labeled with, situational anxiety. It kind of takes me back to my journey of being diagnosed with depression, then anxiety, then bipolar disorder. It's like, okay, well, which is it? And it's like, are we sure based on the full story, not the piece that I'm just telling you, right? And I think that that's a common thing, and there's grief that comes with that too, right? And I talk about that sometimes too, Dr. Karen, with my own journey of
Yeah.
having that label of bipolar disorder, and then the stigma in our society when it comes to mental wellness obstacles. And Dr. Ken, I gotta touch on something really fast because I'm kind of tickled a little bit because literally as you were speaking on the limiting beliefs, right? There tends to be a lot that are uprooted when we are in a grief season or a grief cycle. And I'm just curious, Dr. Karen, what would you say is one of the maybe most common that you experience that maybe a lot of other people do when they experience the grief from either the transition of someone in their life or transitioning from a job, or what's maybe that common limiting belief that a lot of people experience?
So I've worked with over 1,200 individuals in the last 5 years. So let's start here. And I will say the most common limiting belief that I find, no matter whether it is male or female, although I do find this mostly with females, is I'm not enough. I'm not enough. And it shows up in various different ways. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable enough. So let's play that out as I have a passing of, say, a parent. Am I enough or am I good enough to be able to do things on my own when I may have depended upon maybe calling up mom or dad to give me advice about things? Am I enough to be able to do that on my own? Or when they've lost a loved one due to a divorce or a breakup, am I good enough? Am I lovable enough? Am I enough to be able to be on my own? Or am I able to get back into another relationship again? Enough. Am I enough? So that is a big one that I have seen in good, I would say 95% of these over 1,200 clients that I've worked with in the last 5 years.
Ooh, Dr. Karen, I gotta admit, when you were saying that just now, that thought of I'm not enough, I can relate in so many avenues. When I think about my TV career taking a pivot this month in 2017, I believe it's March 24th, 2017. I remember walking out of the newsroom that day. The sky was this perfect blue color, but I remember the thought crossing my mind like, am I good enough to ever come back to TV? And with my mom making her transition, right? Am I good enough to withstand life without her? Am I good enough to continue on living life knowing that her transition is permanent, right? So I can relate to, ooh, that's so deep, Dr. Karen. And I'm just curious, Dr. Karen, for individuals who have that limiting belief of I'm not enough that stems from grief, from whether it's a physical transition, a job, a breakup, what would you recommend, either a mantra or some type of exercise that can help them replace that I am not enough with I am enough?
I am going to address that a question just slightly differently there, Portia. So let's step back to talk more about like how are those beliefs formed in the first place. I think that because it's without going back to the root, it's hard to talk about what to replace it with or a mantra. So that's why I wanted to start there, is identifying where it started. Now, let's say, for example, we had little Susie who at the age of 5, and again, I'm going to make up this situation, little Susie at the age of 5, let's say dad divorces mom and dad leaves. Okay. And little Susie is heartbroken and may even be like some of the children that are like, I think I may have caused this. But dad leaves, and let's say little Susie develops this belief that she feels rejected, and she develops this belief that I'm not lovable enough. Right? I feel rejected by dad, and I create this belief that I'm not lovable enough because if I was lovable, dad would have stayed. Okay. Doesn't mean that it's logical. Does not mean that it's logical. And again, under the age of 7 or 10, it depends upon the theories, there's part of our brain called the critical faculty that takes information in and makes decisions and beliefs about it as a child that are not necessarily rational. We may hear or see certain things and we create this belief about ourselves or the world when we're under the age of somewhere under the age of 7 or 10. Okay, so little Susie, I feel rejected and I'm not lovable enough. Now let's take little Susie into, now she's not 5, she's 25. She's in a relationship, right? She's in a relationship, she's dating somebody, and maybe they decide to get married. So they're getting married and they're moving along, they're having relationship, they're having their anniversaries, this or that. And let's just say it's 35 years. And for whatever reason that her husband decides to leave her. Now, it's not the 35-year-old Susie who's reacting to that. It's the 5-year-old version of Susie that's reacting to that, who feels rejected, who feels I'm not lovable enough. It's not our conscious mind that then puts that on her husband, let's say walking out. It's that belief. It takes her back to that 5-year-old. And now she is reflecting as if here's a male who represents my father. And again, it's not at the conscious level, it's at the subconscious level when these beliefs start showing up. So I wanted to take us back to that, to think about, where is that belief? Where was it created? So in the work that I do, Portia, that's what I do, is I actually, using various different techniques, part of it is hypnotic techniques, to take an individual back to identify when that belief actually was formed and uproot it at that point, and then replace the belief that they do want. All of that, it's a 2-part process that I lead clients through. Go back to when that belief was created, unearth it and release it, and then replace the new belief on top of that. So when I'm working with a client around identifying, and I also work with identifying what is the actual belief that's underneath it. So whether it's a rejection or I'm unlovable, I lead through processes to be able to get to that level. I then lead them through a process to say, what is it that you want that's in place of that? Now, one might think, if I'm looking at a belief, for example, that I'm not lovable, the opposite may be I'm lovable. But in many cases, it's whatever the client. I actually test a couple different things to identify what that is. It may not necessarily be I'm lovable, and maybe I'm amazing. And again, it all depends upon the client. It's really what resonates with them at their level, and then replace that in a process at the subconscious level. We're replacing that belief. Then what I love to do with clients is create a hypnotic induction, so a meditation that they use after working with me that actually continues to reinforce that at the subconscious or unconscious level, that new belief that they have in place. So it's less about mantras. And although mantras are very good, and I actually use some mantras, there's also a caution to using mantras. For example, if let's just take little Susie, and she hasn't done the deep work and she hasn't uprooted this belief that I'm unlovable, if she keeps on saying, I'm lovable, I'm lovable, I'm lovable, but at the unconscious or subconscious level, there's no alignment there, no belief there, then the mantra is not going to work for her. It can over a period of time, but it's going to take a lot of time, because you have to uproot it at the subconscious or unconscious level first to be able to believe this mantra that you're telling yourself.
And Dr. Karen, I got to say that when I think about this little Susie, right, I can relate to that from my parents getting a divorce when I was little, right? And not feeling as though, or thinking like, oh my God, is it my fault that this occurred, right? And it had nothing to do with me, right? Both of them are just two different people. There's nothing wrong with either of them. They just are not compatible in this way. And that's okay, right? I think that, there's a lot of people who have that. It's not like they're bad people or anything like that. They're just not compatible for each other. And it's amazing to me how something from your childhood can be suppressed for so long. But then if a situation arises, such as a breakup, a divorce, transition, how it literally cracks open that egg and all the yolk just comes out everywhere. Just to put it in, in a
It's a
more
good analogy.
in a
Yeah.
more concrete sense. I'm just blown away by that, Dr. Karen. And really quick, Dr. Karen, before we go to break, if one of our listeners wants to connect with you and learn more about you and maybe work with you, is there a website or a social media handle they can connect with you?
Yes, at Dr. Karen Kramer. So Dr. Karen Kramer, make it easy. You can find me on Facebook, can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me I'm on Twitter, but I don't use it, be honest. You can find me on Instagram, and also that is my website. So Dr. Karen Kramer, that's where you can find me. And then there's usually a little button somewhere in the upper right-hand corner to book a call. That's the easiest way to book a free conversation with me.
Excellent. So those of you who want to work with Dr. Karen and learn more about her work and her book, you can visit her drkarenkramer.com. So we're going to take our first quick break right here on the Grief Grantor, everybody. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Karen. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kimberly L. Wilson, also known as Dr. Burnout. You can catch me on Leadership Beyond Burnout on E360 TV on Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Vitality Network, where we focus on emerging women leaders and women leaders.
All right, everybody, welcome back right here on the Grief Grantor. We are joined by Dr. Karen, and we're just continuing our conversation on how we can rethink mourning, right? Karen just gave us an amazing story, an example of how something in our childhood that could be suppressed for so long can be uprooted when we experience transition in our adult life, and how it's important to really do the deep work, right? And give ourselves permission to do that in order to really help us to work with our grief and embody healthy grief processes. So look, Dr. Karen, I'm going to just jump right in, right? I really want to talk about this book, Healthy Grief. So you guys can see it on the screen, Healthy Grief. The foreword was written by Jack Canfield. So Dr. Karen, I want to ask this question, right? In our society, as we know, where depending on the situation that brings upon a grief cycle, right? Like what I mentioned, a breakup, transition, relocation, divorce, whatever. What responses would you consider that many individuals may not as a healthy grief method?
Well, I think what you are referring to, Portia, is part of the subtitle to Healthy Grief, which is normalizing and navigating loss in a culture of toxic positivity. So, what then is toxic positivity? Because shouldn't positivity be helpful? So I dive into it. Thank you, Portia, for opening up that door. I dive into when is positivity not so helpful in the healing process, both as one who's grieving and as one who's a supporter for somebody that's grieving. Now, let's step back a bit. It's even for those of us who are in the United States, it is written into the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness, right? We're to be happy, we're to be healthy, we're to be all these glorious things. And when we're not happy, something is wrong. Or when we're not happy, we're wrong, or we need to be fixed. I.e., if we're grieving and we're not happy, we need to be fixed. So let's just settle on that for just a bit. Like we are in a grief adverse society that doesn't still quite know how to handle this concept called grief and grieving, which is why I'm so thankful for people like you, Portia, and books like Healthy Grief and others that are coming out to really talk about it so we can normalize and navigate it. So with that, let's go talking about how is it that positivity can be toxic. I'm going to start with grievers first. So if we feel like I've even shared with myself after my father passed away is putting on that happy smile, right? Because I wanted to let everybody know that I could handle this. And I sure didn't want anybody to ask me any questions about it. Otherwise, I might break down crying. And I sure didn't want to do that in public. So this is an example of when toxic positivity, when we as grievers are putting ourselves in more of a positive state, putting on that fake smile because we want to hold back. For whatever reason, we want to hold back. We don't want to have people ask us questions. We're not processing through the emotion. Like for me, I was not processing through the emotion. I was focusing on the logistics. How is that toxic? It's toxic because it prevents the griever from healthfully stepping into the grieving process. Just like I told you about my story, it was halted for a month until my beloved cat, I had to put my beloved cat to sleep. And then when I hit the grief cycle, I hit it hard with anger instead of stepping into that emotion cycle. So that is toxic positivity when we ourselves hinder that process. Now, there's good ways about distracting ourselves and not fully having to be in the emotion part of it. And I talk all about various different ways that you can step into the grief process and do it healthfully. You don't have to step in all the way. You can tip your toe into grief. That's good. But let's really step back and talk about toxic positivity from a supporter side. So healthy grief is also not only to help the griever, but it's to help the supporter. So some of the phrases, and Portia, there are 30 grief survival case studies that are in healthy grief. And as I was talking with some of them, I was asking some questions related to what is it that people said to you that just wasn't so helpful. And one of the gentlemen, he ended up not being in my book because he was still heavily going through the grief cycle at that time. And I wanted people who were healthfully enough through that cycle to be able to write their story, to be able to share with readers about where they are and where they are now. So this one gentleman, his son, unfortunately, died by suicide, and it had been 11 years prior to. And one of the things he shared with me is somebody soon after his son passed away said, well, your son's gone to a better place. And this gentleman, mind you, he's in his 60s, to the point where he's like, and said a couple cuss words and said, better place would have been right here with me. Now let's step back a little bit. I'm sure the person who said it to him said it with all good intentions, wanted to say something that was helpful, but in the process was more hurtful to begin with. So in healthy grief, I process through as a supporter the things that we are about to say. Why is it that we want to say it? And I process through that. For example, if I want to say something that pops out of my mouth, is it because I am uncomfortable with somebody else grieving and I want them to feel better so I can feel better? Okay, so it gets to thinking about that. I'm uncomfortable with grief, so I want them to feel better so I can feel better. Another way of looking at it is this whole grief thing, I don't know how to control it. So I want to say or do something that can control or contain it. Okay, so that's another type of person. So thinking about, why is it that I'm about to say what I'm about to say? Is it that I'm trying to make them feel better because I'm uncomfortable? Is it because I'm trying to control this situation, or I want to fix the situation? Is another version of control. I want to step in and tell them how they can fix it. So it's all in thinking about the psychology as a supporter, what may be going through our mind. So there's a bit about psychology that's in there and knowing where we may stand on that. And then going into what are some of the phrases that we can say. I also go into some of the phrases that are toxic positivity and why they are, as well as some of the phrases which you can say. And really, some of those phrases you can say have much more to do with the situation, the type of loss, and the type of relationship that you have with that person. Now, one of my typical responses is, I feel you. Now, that doesn't work with everybody. I'm more kinesthetic. I feel people. So that's just a common way is, I feel you. I do. And one of those things that when it comes to grief that is so helpful is to be seen, heard, and understood, right? So I feel you is a way of connecting with them in that moment without trying to fix them, without trying to take control, without trying to make them feel better. And I even, depending upon who they are, even with my clients, I may say, if they call me up, I say, is this something you want to process through, or is this something you just want me to sit and listen? Because sometimes it's just, let me sit and listen. I had an hour-long conversation with one of my clients one time who was in a heightened angry situation. And all I said were these few words: tell me more. 3 words. Tell me more. And I just let him just keep on going, going, going. Tell me more. Tell me more. And eventually he came up with his own solutions. His energy came down from anger and he was able to process it. So I know I'm going off with the topic, but it's not about fixing. It's not about controlling. It's not about trying to make them feel better so you can feel better. It's being mindful of the words we're using, and is it truly going to help that person feel seen, heard, and understood? And as a griever, when are you ready to take off that fake smile or stop isolating yourself and allow yourself to open up to other people who can see, hear, and understand you and your grief?
Dr. Karen, when you just brought up about this gentleman who received the response of your son's in a better place, right? It makes me think about the responses that we or people tend to make in comparison. For example, I've shared this story before where I encountered a woman who also had the transition of a child to suicide. And their response to me during one of our conversations, this wasn't too long after my mom made her transition, was, "You don't know what it's like to lose a child." And what I like to respond, Dr. Karen, to people who I know who are embarking on their grief journey, whether it's the transition from a job, physical transition of our four-legged companions, our friends, all of those things, I always say, I'm sending my love your way.
Yes.
Right? Instead of, I'm sorry for your loss, I always let them know that I'm thinking of them by saying, I'm sending my love your way. And I'm curious, Dr. Karen, in your experience, what do you think it will take for us to, number one, be more conscious grievers and supporters? And number two, what will it take also to help ease that need for responses such as comparison grief?
Okay, couple different questions in there. So I'm going to approach one and I may have you remind me of some of the others. There is some research out there that does say that the loss of a child is one of the hardest griefs because it defies what naturally should happen. So I will put that out there. As I was researching grief, that is one that's out there. So just acknowledge it and know that the loss of a child and the loss of a child due to death by suicide can be even harder, because it then is like, as a parent, could I have done something differently to be able to say, like, what did I do as a parent? So adds on the guilt on top of that. So I wanted to at least acknowledge that since we brought it up. And one of the stories that is in Healthy Grief is somebody who has a child that she lost, death by suicide, that's in there, and some great information that she has as she shares her own journey that's in there. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Put it aside for just a bit, and you remind me about the comparison. So I was doing some market research here recently, because I'm always a researcher. So looking at the next stage of what's going on with healthy grief, and I'm doing a masterclass associated with the book as well. And these are two friends of mine, actually, as I was talking to them. And one of my friends said, I'm grieving the becoming an empty nester. My youngest son is going off. I've already lost my oldest son going off to college. Now my youngest son will be going off in the fall. Now, mind you, right now we're sitting in March. She's thinking of the fall. So it's anticipatory grief, grieving what's coming up. But what she said right after that was interesting, because she knew I was creating this masterclass. And she said, I do not want to be in a class with another friend of ours who unfortunately lost her son death by suicide here in January. She said, I don't want to be in a class. So some of that comparison. She truly is grieving as an empty nester, but she doesn't want to be in a class and feel like she can't be in her own grief because it's the loss of a child due to suicide is more grief, right? Or imagine if somebody was, and you already hinted upon this, Portia, is somebody who's also the grieving the loss of a pet, but feeling, oh, well, I shouldn't feel the loss of a pet because it's not an actual adult child that's going off to college as an empty nester, or somebody that, who has lost their child due to suicide. Like, who am I to grieve? But if you take them in and of themselves, they have the same type of pain that is going on, having lost that pet. I even have somebody in the market research who said, yeah, I used to see people post about losing their pets on Facebook and all that and social media and thinking, oh, that'll never happen to me. And then I did. I lost my beloved pet and had the same feelings. And you may not know until that experience happens to you. So there is that concept around grief. So my advice in there is, how much are you focusing on the outside world about what you should or shouldn't do, and less about focusing on yourself and what you're going through at the moment? Okay, because if you are coming up with any form of grief associated with any kind of loss, which could be even a loss of a hopes and dreams, that is a loss. That is a grief that you have. And some of that is even disenfranchised grief. I put that in the book as well. Various different types of loss that are not necessarily seen by society as valid to be grieving, but they're truly griefs in and of themselves. So my advice again is, turn within yourself, focus on you. How are you feeling about the process? And stop comparing yourself to somebody else and their own grief. So I wanted to put that in. And I know I haven't addressed all the questions,
No,
Portia. So
I think you have. No, I think you really have, Dr. Karen. I appreciate you shedding light on that, because I think in our society, right, as you mentioned, when it comes to the physical transition of a parent losing a child, whether it's empty nest or as either by death, right? I think that there is this notion that this isn't the way that things are supposed to go.
Yes.
Right? And I think for those parents, you reminded them to give themselves that permission to feel how they want to, not based on what the society notion or narrative is telling us. Because I think maybe even for you, Dr. Karen, you learned through your own grief journeys that the way society depicts grief is not the way that grief looks in our physical everyday. It's
Yes.
that duality where life is continuing going on. It's like our whole world has been uprooted, like taking a tree out of the yard from the roots, and we're left there watching it go away while cars are still going up and down the street. Somebody's getting engaged at Disney World. Somebody else just hit the lottery. And that's the thing with grief that I don't think we talk enough about, is that duality piece and
Yeah.
how much it impacts our whole world. So I appreciate you shedding light on that, Dr. Karen. And I'm curious, Dr. Karen, for this book, right, Healthy Grief, you mentioned that it's for both the supporter and the person who's grieving or the griever. Would you say, Dr. Karen, that this book was something that you needed during that time of your grief? And if it is, what's maybe something that, if someone who's tuning in, whether they're a supporter of someone who's grieving or a griever themselves, what's maybe something that you were really seeking outside of obviously the person to come back, right? But what's something that really you were seeking when you were needing comfort in your grief?
Two thoughts come to mind, and the second one gets back to the mall analogy we talked about yesterday. So The first thought is, I just need to know that there's hope. I needed hope and inspiration. I needed to know that there are people out there who survived divorcing twice here. I needed to know that there were people out there who can still live beyond losing a parent or a sibling. That after health challenges, there were people out there who had overcome and can move forward. There were people out there who dealt with the significant health of a child and were able to overcome and move through that. And when I say overcome, it is be able to manage, be able to accept, be able to process through that. And these were just some of the situations that I was in. And also I was seeing that with my client. So in Healthy Grief, there are four main parts to the book. The first is, if you like to look into the science and looking at it from the culture, the limiting beliefs, how it impacts the body, the first part is more the logistics. The second part I'm going to get back to, which is a framework. The third is that hope and inspiration. That's where I have the 30 different grief survival case studies that are there of different people who have gone through different types of grief. In fact, I have 7 different categories, such as the passing or the death and dying, the intimate relationships, such as divorce and breakups, to other types of relationships like family and friendship estrangements, to career, so loss of identity, to maternity losses that are in there. And then even going into the 7th category, which is a trilogy of losses. So also called complex grief, where there is 3 different types of losses all back to back. And then the 4th part of it is resources, various different resources that are there. So I needed hope. So I've had a number of people who have bought Healthy Grief, say friends of mine that are like, hey, I want to support you, buy Healthy Grief. And by the way, it is a 2-pound textbook. It is 408 pages. I stuffed it with a whole bunch of information in there. And so then my friends are like, oh, I'm going through this grief. And I'm like, did you read the book? Well, no. I'm like, and because I know them, I'm like, go to this story or go to this section in it, because sometimes the very first thing is I want to go to a story that relates to me, to know that there are other people out there. I am not the only one. And I think that's the main phrase there, Portia, is I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. I'm not alone. There's other people who have gone down this path. So that is one thing that I really want people to know. And that's what I've gone to is that hope and that inspiration. And then the second really gets into, which is part 2 of the book, which is the framework. So you even mentioned at the beginning, there's Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And usually when we talk about grief and stages, that's usually what people lean on. Then, not that I'm going to ask you, Portia, because you probably would be able to rattle them off. But for those of you who are watching, can you rattle off all 5 stages of Kubler-Ross? You might be able to pick up on some pieces of it, but most people can't easily rattle it off. And also, her original research was based upon those who had life-threatening illnesses. Mm-hmm. Like they were in the process of passing. So that stage was created around those people. And then she stepped back and she used it around some other grief. But when you look at various different types of grief situations, even like the grief of going through a divorce, that process doesn't necessarily hold true. It can help. It can help in understanding it doesn't necessarily hold true. But let's start back with the first. Sometimes we can't even remember what it is. So what I did in Healthy Grief was create the 5-stage Healthy Grief framework. The word grief, now mind you, I went in the shower and I'm like, I need to come up with something simple. Hot water moment in the shower. And I walked out and I went, grief, that's it. It's a 5-letter acronym. So I created the Healthy Grief framework. It is a very simple and easy framework to remember and understand and to be able to use it with various different types of losses. like many of the ones that we've already talked about. So the essence, without going through the whole process of the stage, is basically, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are the action steps you're planning on taking? What support do you need? And what does the future look like? Even if it is, what does the future look like at the end of today or at the end of the week? That's the essence of the 5-stage framework. And it is very simple and easy to go through. So why do I create this? This gets back to the mall analogy that we talked about. And it's imagine, for example, that you are going on a road trip. Again, analogy here. You're going on a road trip and you're going camping and you're going hiking and you're driving through a state you're not familiar with or a town you're not familiar with. And you realize, okay, I forgot my hiking boots. And right now I could really go to the bathroom and I need to eat. Okay. So you need hiking boots, you need to go to the bathroom, and you're hungry. So you pull off and you see a mall. Okay, mall, I can get all three of those met in a mall, right? I want it quick because I want to get back on the road. I want to go to the mall. So you go to the mall, but you've never been to this mall before. So you walk in the mall, and the first thing you want to do is you want to look for the kiosk, right? You look for the kiosk that'll let you know the mall map as to where things are. So one of the first things you're going to do after you find that kiosk is you're going to identify, like, what are the different stores and things that they have in here? Like, are they going to get me? Do they have restrooms? What kind of food do they have in here? What kind of shoe places do they have? So you're going to identify, for example, where the bathrooms are. You're going to identify the food. Well, no, I don't want a hot dog on a stick, but hey, In-N-Out burger, that looks good because I want a burger, right? Identify that. And then shoes. Do I want to go? I don't want to get high heel shoes. I want to go to this place that's a hiking place where I know I can get shoes. So you've identified what kind of stores you want to go to or where you want to go to. The next step is to look at the map. Well, where are these various different stores and places you want to go to? Where is the REI, which is the word I'm thinking of, the store for hiking boots, right? Where is the In-N-Out burger place that I'm going to find on there because I really want my burger? But there's various different restrooms which are all over the place. So the third thing I'm going to do when I'm looking at this map is to figure out, where am I on this map? Where's the X or the red dot? Because if I really need to go to the bathroom, I don't want to run to the bathroom that's on the far end of the mall from where I am. I want to go to the bathroom that's located next to me. Now, why do I use this analogy? Well, as I was sharing with Portia earlier, doing these market research calls, one of the things when I'm talking with individuals who are deep in the middle of their grief, whether it's the loss of, I just found out my husband's cheating and he wants a divorce, to I just lost or I had the transition of a loved one. I'm sitting in the middle of grief right now. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm frustrated. I'm lost. I'm alone. I don't know where to go. And the mall map is that analogy that's there. The healthy grief framework is there to provide the framework of that mall. You're in a mall. That's okay. We got you. You're in a mall. And identify those certain things that they do need, whether it is, what are some things that you do when you need a break? Who are the important people to rely on, whether they're the emotional support or maybe the legal or the other kinds of support that you need, the financial support that's there. Like, what's your safe place? What are the things you want to do? So you're mapping out your mall map and identifying, where are you on your own unique path to healing? So it's a place to come back to know the framework of where you are, that you're there. You're not just lost. As somebody mentioned to me, she said, I'm so overwhelmed. It's like being on a road that keeps on going and going and going, but I don't know if I'm going to get there in an hour or in 3 days. And I don't even know what there is or what it looks like. So this mall map idea is the idea that it's the framework to guide you through the process healthfully and give you a sense about where you are on your unique path to healthy grieving.
And Dr. Karen, I know when we talked about the mall map analogy, I loved it because I think it's perfect. And it, really gives you that concrete picture of this is where I'm currently at. Now I have some place to start. Now I just need to determine, okay, one step. We'll take one step there, whether we go pay the Pied Piper a little extra or we go find our running shoes, whatever it might be. Dr. Karen, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on and sharing with us your words of wisdom, your research, your book, Healthy Grief. So for our audience who's tuning in, if you guys want to get a copy of the book, this is what it looks like. You can find it. You can go to Dr. Karen's website and learn more about it or get a copy for yourself, for your organization, whatever it might be. Dr. Karen, I thank you again for coming on the show and sharing this with us. Well, everybody, that concludes another conversation right here on the Grief Grantor. Thanks for tuning in, and until next week, everybody, take care.
Thank you for joining us on the Grief Grantor. May the story shared today light your path and guide your heart toward healing. Remember, with every moment of grief, there's an opportunity for gratitude, resilience, and empowerment. Continue your journey with us online and share your own story, because in this tapestry of life, every thread matters, especially yours.